Welcome today to the home of Unitarian Universalism in Central Washington. My name is Chris Rader. I serve on your worship, greeters, and building and grounds teams. I'm also the celebrant for today's service. If you're a visitor this morning, we are so glad you're here. We welcome every person of goodwill, just as you are, whatever your age, whatever your background, whatever body you inhabit, whomever you love, you're welcome here. We invite everyone to join us for a social hour after the service, both in person and on Zoom. For the folks on Zoom, you can find our order of service and the lyrics in the chat. It's so good to be together this morning in all the ways we gather. We're glad you're here. Our fellowship is located on the ancestral homeland of the Pasquosa, also called the Wenatchee. For thousands of years, the Pasquosa have been stewards of this land, fishing, hunting, gathering roots and berries, and practicing cultural traditions. The Pasquosa still live here. We sadly acknowledge that their land has been taken over because the U.S. government broke treaty obligations and carelessly allowed uninvited white colonists to settle here. We stand alongside our indigenous neighbors as they continue their traditions and seek to have all their rights recognized. We acknowledge our shared responsibility to sustain right relationships with each other and the land.
I thought I'd go ahead and remind you about worship. Some people have been trained to take the word worship as a time of leaving the world and bowing one's head. For us, worship is thinking of what is of greatest worth. It means focusing and opening our minds on what is of greatest worth and value, not only to us as individuals, but to us as a group, to find out what it is that we value and how that connects with what others value, and then hold it up. So in that spirit, we gather for worship and we light the chalice.
This is the time in our service when we kindle a sacred flame, as do Unitarian Universalists all over the world. This chalice is a symbol of this congregation. Its body, like ours, is made of the earth. It's solid and tall, holding the flame safe and steady. Then the flame is an image of our reasons for being a congregation. It shines with the light of liberating truth. It glows with the warmth of compassionate love, and it burns with the energy of our lives working for peace and justice. Thomas will light the chalice, reminding us that we are gathered to worship together all that is best in the world.
Unitarian Universalists like change. We are progressive. We are the heart of progressive or liberal or open or forward-looking religion. We know that evil and harm run in the world, and we know that no one alone can stop or change all that harm, heal all the wounds, and so we gather together to change the world for the better. Because of our knowledge of good, of goodness, of change and progress, for thousands of years, both as individuals and members of a great religious tradition, we have initiated and been at the forefront of change and transformation. Unitarian Universalists like change, and now we are changing again. You have changed your lead minister, and I have changed the congregation I serve. But that's just the beginning. My presence, my style, my interests, my experiences are all very different than those of Reverend Soley or Reverend Shenham. Powerful ministers as they are different than me, and I am different than them. And you are different than all the congregations I've served, which has been many. So we have change, and change is coming, and there will be different things, and things will be set a little akimbo and feel uncomfortable perhaps at times. We can be excited about that. We can be open to that. We can celebrate change. We need to accept the fact that everything, everywhere, all at once, is changing. Always. Sometimes being open affirming for change is essential because the change we call for is good. For instance, I really liked the Barbie movie because it was about change. Now, I also like the Barbie movie because the director and creator of that movie, Greta Gerwig, is UU. I don't know if you all know that. If in her movie, Frances Ha, you'll see the character goes back to her childhood home, which just happens to be, and goes to the church with her family, to religion on Sunday with her family, and it just happens to be the UU Society of Sacramento, California. And because of that, she understands change. And because of that, she didn't just make a Mattel movie about Barbie. She made a Mattel movie about how Barbie has been changing and has always been changing and has changed in many ways with all her community of Barbie friends. And that's because the real world, which is not made out of pink plastic, is always changing. And so she must change with it. And in the movie, part of the message of the movie is that change may be fun and good and something that you want, but it'll also be complicated, and who knows where it's going to take you. But change is also hard. So being open to change is easy when it's fun and it's good things and good liberation is happening in the midst of it, but sometimes change is very difficult. Others may know how many psychiatrists it takes to change a light bulb. One, but it'll also take a complete review of the life of the previous bulb and a reassessment of the purposes of lighting. So my second point is that when change is difficult, it's difficult because it's hard to be open. It's difficult to be open to it because it's hard to be open to something that causes us pain and discomfort. I'm always complaining about my computer. The other day I opened up my email program, and because of an update, it had completely changed the way it looked, what the icons were, where they were. It has a lot more power now. It could do a lot more, but I didn't want it to do anymore. I liked it the way it was. And we're constantly, all of us who deal with computers are being forced to go through these new menus and new pathways all the time, and it can become exhausting. I remember when computers were first coming into the world and everyone was trying to get used to their computers, and I had a Mac in my office at the church, and then we were doing anti-poverty work, and there were all these people who didn't own computers. You know, the cell phones were still just phones, and they wanted to get jobs, but they would go in to apply for a job, and there was no longer a piece of paper and a pen that was given to them. They were given a computer and said, "You got to fill out the form here." And they didn't know how to fill out forms. They didn't know what they were doing. So we were doing training, trying to help people learn. And over, we're all learning. Several years ago, I was forced to I made a choice to change. I wanted to move closer to my granddaughter, so I looked for a congregation that was close to where my granddaughter and daughters lived, and I moved. I initiated change, thought it was all good change, and then that all went awry. And suddenly I was an interim minister. I love what I do. I chose not to change that and to be a UU minister and to stay with UU congregations. But as a result, over the past 7 years, I have moved 5 times. I've changed the place where I lived. I've forced my wife to be dragged from place to place. She didn't go to Southern California so much, but she did visit me when I was down there. Didn't change that either. We've stayed together. Every time you move, I say, you lose something. So even though I chose those changes, I had to learn how to be centered. And part of it was being excited about what new possibilities, learning how to be excited about learning what new grocery stores were. I remember when I was in Southern California, and there was this new grocery store called Vaughn's. And I thought, whoa, what is this? This will be different. And I walk in, and it is exactly, the layout and the appearance is exactly like the Safeway I had just left up in Washington State. Nothing had changed. It was really crazy. But Coyote learns in that story, as we all learn over and over, that trying to be in charge of change can still get us into trouble. I think of Coyote as a great icon for Unitarian Universalists because he's very clever and he likes to think about things and he wants to initiate change and he's got all sorts of power. He has power. We forget that we have power. But often, the unintended consequences, the unexpected consequences are what gets him into trouble. He's a good icon for Unitarian Universalists, icon for all humanity. I think about humanity. We're so smart. We can invent internal combustion engines. We can invent fossil fuel burning generators. We can shoot ourselves to the moon and come back safely, and yet we are so collectively foolish and short-sighted, flying all the time that we don't see until it's almost too late that we might ruin everything we love with our so clever contraptions and changes and improvements. And then all these other changes are going on. Remember we used to talk in the middle of the 20th century about this vision of a global community. We never really talked about how absolutely confusing and stressful this is going to be. All of a sudden, we are connected in all sorts of ways, and we are rubbing against each other in different ways, and different cultures, different racial and sexual identities and understandings of those are colliding with each other. And we have created mazes and sources of stress. And in response, there are people who are fighting for a sense of control, trying to resist change as much as they can, or at least gain a sense of control over what changes and what does not. One of those, one example I like to hold up is Ron DeSantis and his anti-woke act. I've always liked the idea of being awake, of waking up in the morning. I'm a morning person, fresh and clear. I've always been moved by the Buddhist metaphor of being awakened, as being enlightened, as being liberated and free from all the dukkha, the power that causes us suffering, the mind states and ways of being that cause us to suffer. I think about the suffering that caused Tony Figueroa to be shot, a 13-year-old boy to be shot in Wenatchee. There's pain there. There's suffering. But I was pleased to see the Comunidad para Avance de la Educación Familiar Cafe group organized immediately responding to address the sources of gang violence in teenagers, the ways in which families are being undermined, to help people wake up from those conditions and not just let teenagers wander into these gangs. In 2015, when I lived in St. Louis, we were fighting violence, gang violence. There were parts of that city, impoverished, almost 90% black, intentionally so, over hundreds of years of practice, where the murder rate was huge. There was one of the most painful things to see was a junior high that had memorials of all of the junior hires who had died in gun violence. And then the city of St. Louis seemed to wake up. And there was first Michael Brown, and then within 2 weeks, Kajami Powell, both killed by police. Police who were supposed to be keeping people safe and ending violence, killed these two young men. And the city seemed to wake up. 453 continuous days of protest and only 2 incidents of property damage during all that time. And in the midst of that protest, of all that organizing, of all that consciousness raising, I resonated with those who named the state of being aware of the evils in the world and the injustice in the world and the violence and the oppression living in our communities all the time. They described that as being woke. Being aware, being woke. It resonated with my Buddhist grounding. And I loved it. There was one moment where Tracy Blackman, Reverend United Church of Christ minister, and Tracy Blackman, were talking, and she, at the end of it, just wanted to encourage me. We were sort of talking about all the people who were coming up with militarized responses to nonviolent protest. And at the end of it, she just said, "Stay woke." And I felt this unity, this togetherness. Don't go to sleep about injustice, she said. Continue to be open to the possibilities and power of change, she was saying. But then there's Ron DeSantis, leading his state to pass the so-called Individual Freedom Act, which she calls the Stop Woke Act. As soon as I heard Stop Woke, I thought, he just doesn't want to wake up. He wants to stop waking up and go back to sleep. We all want to go back to sleep. The state law explicitly expanded anti-discrimination laws to prohibit schools and companies from leveling guilt or blame onto students or employees based on race or sex. Guess what? A call for change, even when needed and good, can cause guilt and shame and discomfort, sadness, or blame. Especially when the call for change attacks something that you care about, undermines something that you're comfortable, something that you've long accepted, you can feel bad. Those not wanting to feel bad seek to control what changes and how it changes and when it changes. They're driven usually by fear and anger and discomfort. They tend to gravitate towards authoritarian or even what we call fascist methods to get what they want. Reverend Cecilia Kingman, in the Berry Street lecture, given as always, the lecture is always given right before our National General Assembly, so I was listening to her back in June. And she noticed that this resistance to change is not just in the Republicans in Florida. She said it's in UU communities, Unitarian Universalists. So specifically speaking to UU ministers about UU communities, she said, we are moving away from individualism to communitarian ways of being. From white supremacy culture to truly radical liberation and inclusion, from a concentration of power among historically privileged groups and towards a new form of power sharing. And some are responding to these shifts with anxiety and conflict. Some who are being asked to give up the primacy of their privilege and power are responding with tactics drawn from fascist politics. She went on to detail what those tactics were. But this is not just merely a problem of our time or American political culture, it is really global. I heard about a guy who went into a mini mart. He wanted to buy a 6-pack of beer. He put down a $20 bill, and the cashier gave him some change. And he said, I don't want any of this. He pushes it back. And he said, look at these coins. They're all changing. Remember the penny used to have the Lincoln Memorial on it, and now it's got this weird shield. And these quarters, they all have national parks instead of an eagle. And he said, I've never liked change. I don't want change. Pushes it back. And the guy said, they all still have the same value, and some of the changes are kind of nice. And he goes, no, you don't understand. I just don't like all those coins rattling around in my pocket. I don't like change. To be open to change, we need to notice why we are closing ourselves off, shutting down. It's a powerful practice, a Buddhist practice called the 5 remembrances, which is just remembering. We all get sick. We're all growing old. We all will die. Everything we know and everything we love is subject to change, and we can't own anything except our own actions in this moment. Now, if you listen to this list just right off, you might get a little depressed, and that's really the point. The point is to notice how many of these 5 basic truths we ignore, we avoid, we put fences around and walls around, and we try to seal ourselves off. And the whole point is to open ourselves to reality, even the difficult parts of it, because the more clear and grounded and present we are with one another, the more clear and grounded and present we can be with angry people, with frightened people, with even people who are tending towards violence, to notice, to notice. Whether you are atheist, or Christian, or Hindu, you must accept that all living can be chaotic and that everything, everywhere, all at once is changing. And then we find different resources, depending on our tradition, depending on our individual spirituality, as to what that is. Jewish scripture says, that has God saying, I never change. Sorts of confidence, sorts of comfort. Christians echo that, and Christ is the same yesterday, through Paul's words. Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. I had one scientist who once told me, gravity is a constant, and I can always know that all material has the power of gravity, and that more material creates gravity, and that it's constant and consistent. It's dependable. To find what your grounding is essential. To be open to the variations in it. Almost as fun this year in movies as Barbie was Everything, Everywhere, All at Once. It takes a Buddhist approach to change and chaos. It starts with Evelyn. Evelyn's life is in chaos. Everything, everywhere, all the time is falling apart. Her family, her business, perhaps even her own sanity. The deepest division is between her and her daughter, named, not coincidentally, Joy. She's losing joy. Then the movie goes into me this very fun, creative wildness about multiverses and powers and all these kinds of things. I know of at least 3 Unitarian Universalists in the Shoreline UU Church who gave up streaming the movie. They were streaming it into their living rooms, just gave up in the middle of this chaos. But I love these kinds of movies, sci-fi movies, right? So I was just going along, what's going on? I thought it was all going to be about this fun multiverse, Marvel movies, right? It was going that direction. But then Evelyn's moment of breaking through comes in what Buddhists call metta practice, or loving kindness practice. Her first big fight, the horrible villain, Jamie Lee Curtis's brilliant and terrifying Deidre, the IRS agent, right? Evelyn is told she must tell Deidre she loves her and mean it. It's almost impossible for her to do this, because spiritual change is difficult. Spiritual openness is difficult. But ultimately, she's transformed. And after coming to accept and understand the multiverse, and understand that you can't understand the multiverse, and giving up on the craziness of everything, she drops all the parallel lines and she comes back to the ordinary world where she carries herself with equanimity and warmth and fearlessness. After escaping the black hole of the everything bagel, to save her daughter, she stands in the ordinary world. She stops Joy, both the state of being and her daughter, from leaving the New Year's party. As one writer put it, she's seen emptiness through the black ink, black Enso of the everything bagel, and even through the illusions of life, the meaningless of life, she has become free. And then she is free to choose whatever she wishes, and her choice is to become love. To become love for her daughter, to Waymond, her husband, for her father, for Deidre, for the perfect drabness of her laundromat and her life of seeming failure. And in this love she shines. In a Zen phrase, Evelyn returns to the marketplace with gift-bestowing hands. So we're all facing change and stress. And in all of that, I have always found that compassion and love helps me stop overthinking things and to just be present, to stop being afraid. May we all find in the midst of change and chaos and fear how to follow what transcends all that chaos and fear, May we live not by escaping or denying the world, but to be clear, compassionate openness in the midst of change. So may we all be together. So may we be as individuals, as a community of love and power. We now extinguish the flame, but not the light of truth, not the warmth of love, nor the energy of our actions. These we carry in the chalices of ourselves until we gather in worship.